Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is part of the seminar series organized by Loughborough University Nationalism Network. We are excited to have Dr. Chiara Bonacchi with us today. She is Chancellor's Fellow in Heritage, Text and Data Mining and Senior Lecturer in Heritage at the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on the intersections between heritage, identity, and the politics of past, using both data-intensive and qualitative approaches. Dr. Bonacchi is the receiver of the Philip Leverhulme Prize in Archaeology and has led or co-led several UK-based and international research projects funded by UKRI, Leverhulme, and the EU Commission. So today, Dr. Bonacchi will be discussing how people's perceptions and experiences of the ancient past shape political identities in the digital age, drawing on her recent book, Heritage and Nationalism, Understanding Populism Through Big Data. So after the presentation, we will have a 20-minute Q&A section. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to send them via the chat box, or you can use the hand-raising function. Please also note this talk will be recorded and posted on the LUNN webpage. Okay, so now let's welcome Dr. Bonacchi to give us the talk.
Thank you very much, Roning, and thank you, Marco, as well for inviting me today. I'll start by sharing my presentation. I can hear a little bit of.
Yeah, can you please close the microphone, the people in the room? Ronnie, can you also admit the people that are waiting in the lobby, please? Close the microphone, thank you.
Okay. Again, thank you very much for having me. I was invited to speak about my the research that has been recently published as part of this UCL Press book, Heritage and Nationalism, Understanding Populism Through Big Data, which came out last March, actually, and is also available as a free ebook if you check on the UCL Press website if you're interested. Now, the research that is written up in that book emerges from a larger project funded by the AHRC between 2016 and 2019. This was a collaborative project between Durham University, Durham Archaeology and Anthropology, and first UCL and then Stirling, as I changed affiliation. The project was called Ancient Identities in Modern Britain, and looked to examine how different people experience and value the Iron Age and Roman past in England, Scotland and Wales today. The idea was to undertake this study using a methodology that could combine offline ethnography at heritage sites and museums with the analysis of online interactions with the past through both data-intensive and qualitative kinds of analysis of social media data in particular. So I was looking after the second half of the project, looking at the research focused on digital heritage, online interactions with the past. My colleagues at Durham were focused on the offline ethnography at heritage sites and museums. At the time, and this was our starting point, there was very little coordinated research, in fact, no coordinated research and very few individual studies that looked to understand how people experience and values the late prehistoric and Roman past today. plenty of research on how this kind of past was used in the past, particularly the 19th century, early 20th century, also in relation to nationalist discourse, but very little on contemporary uses of the past. And what we wanted to look at particularly was whether what we had observed through a scoping study could be applied more broadly, which is that we notice that people tend to refer to this kind of past using what Mary Beard has also called insistent dualities, oppositions between periods and very binary ways of referring to these two periods. The idea of insistent dualities is something that Mary Beard and John Anderson use in a chapter about the presentation of the Roman past in museums in Britain. And in this chapter, they stress that they present the concept through an example and by asking a series of questions. They say, is Roman Britain Roman or native? Is it British or foreign? Is it part of the seamless web of our island story or an ignominious period of enemy occupation? The origins of European civilization on our shores or an unpleasant artificial intrusion that actually managed to postpone British civilization for almost 1,000 years? Can we avoid taking sides? And if not, whose side are we on? So what we wanted to look at was if we could find these binary ways of mentioning the past through positions like civilization and barbarism, a militarized past versus a peaceful past, cultural homogeneity and multiculturalism, or not, and if so, how. This was the overarching aim of the project. Within it, the online side, the digital heritage research focused on studying the variable ways in which people, places, objects, practices, and ideas from the Iron Age to the early medieval past of Britain are used to support or oppose populist nationalist discourse on social media. Discourse put forward by politicians, parties, and also private citizens through grassroots types of social media activism, and particularly focusing on 3 case studies linked to UK, Italian, and US politics, although each of these has a different level of internationalization, if you like, a different international sort of status. Brexit, the general election of 2018 in Italy, and the US-Mexican border debate. And in this presentation, I will focus more on the first two in particular. So the idea was to understand how this past that I mentioned, this ancient pre-modern past, has been used in the context of nationalist discourse, where nationalism was understood as having cultural, economic, and political declinations. And also drawing on Fuchs' Nationalism 2.0 book, where nationalism is presented as defining a collective inside against an outside and proclaiming pride in and the need to defend concepts such as our economy, our country, and our way of life. So the point was to understand how these kinds of demarcations between in-groups and out-groups were fueled by equally binary ways, or the equally binary ways in which the past is often referenced today. And the analysis led to understand how binary oppositions between periods are used to mold myths of origin, resistance, and collapse that are then differently used to support or oppose populist nationalist discourse. Why social media? well, first because it's a good site to look at nationalism and populism. Gerbaudo talks about an elective affinity between social media and populism. And social media nationalism. It's a place where people's voice, it's a place where people can voice their concerns, and relevant parties, politicians can really play into these thoughts and expressions and complaints, seeking support. But also because social media, if mined at scale, can allow to identify those very rare occurrences when people serendipitously refer to the present, speak about contemporary issues by mentioning the past in an unsolicited way. And of course, this is something that raises a number of very important ethical concerns, because, and this is really important to flag. The research used a large quantity of data that was extracted from social media platforms, particularly Facebook and Twitter, in an automated way. And without asking for informed consent, as it is common practice within studies that are informed by big data. However, this kind of data extraction was limited to public Facebook pages when it comes to Facebook. So places where users could have reasonable expectations of being read and somehow observed. And when it comes to Twitter, it focused on the collection of tweets containing specific hashtags, which again are signs that signal the intention of connecting the text, the contribution to a wider theme, a wider discussion on Twitter, on social media. So in terms of research design, the research that is published in the book uses about 60 million data points that were extracted from Twitter and from Facebook's public APIs. We also looked at newspaper articles, but this was not done in an automated way. Through text mining, it was a qualitative type of analysis. And the three case studies share a data core. So we looked at the public Facebook pages of key parties and leading politicians, and the public Facebook pages that related specifically to those three themes that I mentioned. So Brexit, the elections of 2018 in Italy, and the US-Mexican border debate. We also looked at tweets containing hashtags that linked to those three themes that I mentioned, as well as tweets published by the Twitter accounts of, again, politicians and parties in the US, Italy, and the UK. And then this data was analyzed first quantitatively in order to understand the context. So with techniques that vary from topic modeling to simpler term frequencies, term associations, cluster analysis. And then this helped to also define subsets of data that could be analyzed more qualitatively through discourse analysis. First, I will, to show the workflow, the kind of analysis that was done, I'll talk about a specific case study, which was used to test the methods and the analytical process. And this is the Brexit case study. So the case study that looks at uses of this past in the context of discussions about Brexit and how these past can contribute to nationalist positions as defined at the beginning. So through the Facebook API, we extracted all the Facebook pages that we could retrieve together with the content, which had Brexit in their title or their descriptions. It was about 362 Facebook pages, about 1.2 million posts, comments, and replies in total. And then we analyzed first the actors behind these Facebook pages, those who set them up. And we could see from the metadata, available, we could see that about half of these pages were set up by groups that were established offline, most of which were UK-based. By groups, I mean groups that shared a common interest, political affiliation, institutional affiliation, specific social concerns, nationality, Italians in the UK, for example, or voting preference. Then we did a topic modeling of all this textual material that we had extracted to see the kinds of topics that were coming up. And these pretty much covered the range of the topics you would expect in discussions about Brexit. So we had, UK stakeholders, the economy, pre-referendum evaluation, costs and benefits, the voting process, so on and so forth. And this was by using a method that was not using keywords, but was uncovering without a priori keywords the hidden thematic structures that were present in this large corpus. And after this, after having done this, using instead a set of about 600 keywords relating to those periods that I mentioned, and these keywords were different ways of referring to the Iron Age or Roman past. So ways of referring to the periods. They were sites, people that related to this period, in Britain specifically. Using this set of keywords, we identified a subset of posts, comments, and replies that potentially had mentions of the Iron Age and Roman past, and then we validated them manually. And the number of these mentions was much lower, was about 3,000 texts altogether for the Brexit case study in particular, out of 1.2 million. And then we just started analyzing this material quantitatively or semi-quantitatively, and then progressively moving to qualitative analysis. So first, we looked at the kinds of past that was recurring the most, and this was primarily the Roman past. There were words frequently repeated, such as of course, Roman, but also Britannia. Britannia here was mentioned a lot in the context of rule Britannia, used with nationalistic overtones, and ideas of barbarism, to which I'll return in a little bit. And then through using term associations, we could see the kinds of ideas that were linked to this idea of a Roman world in the context of Brexit discussions. And we could see that it was the Roman past was often evoked through the concept of the Roman Empire, which was compared to the European Union. And it was evoked to refer to power dynamics, mobility and discrimination, militarization, occupation, and resistance. And then through qualitative analysis, it was possible to see what kinds of myth of origins were molded through these mentions of a Roman Empire compared to the European Union. And we could see that from the pro-Brexit camp, these myths of origin tended to stress pre-Roman or post-Roman origin myths, which saw the Roman Empire as the domineering force coming to oppress and take freedom away. Whereas from the Remain camp, we could see narratives that were referring to mixed origins, the fact that we do not come from a very specific people within a very specific and almost closed period in time, but that things are a bit more complex than that. As it was, of course, also an international type of discussion, it was possible to see where contributions were coming from the European continent, or voices identifying with the European continent, and their myths of origin could be very different. For instance, identifying with this idea of the civilizing Romans, that came and brought something really good to Britain. And obviously these myths were played out in different ways to support the different camps. There were also myths of resistance, so Boudica was coming up a lot to stress the free fighting nature that should encourage British people to resist to the dominion of this Roman Empire European Union. And then myths of collapse, to which I will return. So this idea of the collapse of the Roman Empire, and how, well, for one camp, Britain would collapse if remaining in the European Union. From the other, Britain would collapse if leaving the European Union. So different types of uses of the same type of trope, the fall of the Roman Empire. And then this is what came out of the sort of grassroots analysis of Brexit activism. When looking at what the kinds of uses of this past made by political parties and leading politicians in the UK and Italy, and here I'm aware that I'm just sort of giving a taste and of some of the aspects that came out of the analysis in the time given. What was possible to evidence was that the ancient past was heavily mobilized by populist nationalist parties, which are more electorally marginal, and in some cases more extremist or with a longer tradition. For example, Casa Pound Italia, BNP, UKIP up to 2017 are all examples. And in contrast, if we look at sort of newer parties or renewed parties, as in the case of the League, these parties tended to remove the deep past from their official discourse. It's something that was possible to observe for techno-populist parties, techno-populist party like the Five Star Movement. But also from, as I was saying, the League. And the case of the League is obviously very interesting because it's a party that has relied on the origin myth of Celts and the idea of Celts resisting Rome and the domination of Rome, and therefore able to sort of continue fighting for being a separate entity from Italy, and this is sort of the has been the core, the soul of the narrative of the League for decades, until about 2012, 2013, when things changed substantially. I'll just Salvini, first Maroni and then Salvini, come to the fore, and they sort of reshape, they restyle the League after a number of scandals that had tainted this party. And they change it and reshape it in a way that moves the party perhaps towards the right side of the spectrum more substantially, but also that looks to support a nationalist and nationwide narrative that could help this party to attract votes across Italy. And also for this reason, they abandon these mentions of the deep past, of the Celtic past that were so present in their early discourse and narrative. And another reason to go light, to not use a lot of references to the past, is of course to try and show that there is a difference between these new parties, or parties that wanted to present themselves as being new, Five Star Movement and the League, and what was presented as something that had been around for a longer time, established parties like the Democratic Party that used culturally more intellectual, if you like, types of references to particularly the classical past. Quite often in this picture you can see, for example, Renzi, who meets Mark Zuckerberg and has a gift, which is the Cicero's De Amicizia, to acknowledge, to sort of pay tribute to the befriending function that made Facebook famous. But what happens amongst the base of the Five Star Movement and the League is quite different. They do use the deep past quite a bit, including to protest against, for example, in the case of the League, the reshaping of the party in this more sort of nationalist and civilizationalist form. So there are posts, for example, that say, we used to be Celts, and what is left of us now. So the idea that you may reshape the discourse, you may also rethink the kind of language that you use and how you present your party narrative, but your base may or may not follow, and resists some of these rapid changes, also in the origin myths that are presented and supported. And the past was mentioned by individuals who posted on the pages of the Five Star Movement and the League, and of the leaders through binaries and oppositions that are quite similar to those that I was mentioning for the Brexit case study. So civilization and barbarism, again, cultural homogeneity and multiculturalism, oppression and freedom, and militarization, and a peaceful kind of living. And however, the way in which these oppositions are used is different, and the oppositions are played out in opposite ways compared to the Brexit case study. I was mentioning earlier the example of the origin myth. So within the Brexit camp, we see origin myths that stress free indigenous population that came before the Romans and free people who came after the Romans, or mixed origins. Within, instead, populist nationalist discourse on these pages, we see origin myths that are profoundly rooted in ideas of a Roman triumphant past that civilizes other and is presented as superior. With a number of other heroes that are stressed, as we had Boudica in the Brexit case study here. We have mainly Caesar coming to the fore. And I also looked quite a bit at the kinds of expert authority that was leveraged by grassroots groups as part of their discourse. What kinds of sources were they mentioning to support and legitimize their uses of the past to talk about the present? We have here a prevalence of broadcasting, mainly television, and reading, in some cases newspapers, but also quite a bit books, including books that were read at school, school books. These analyses in particular focused on the ways in which one trope that I was referring to earlier, the fall of the Roman Empire, is upheld. Because this is a trope that we find in the 3 case studies, including the US-Mexican border debate. So it provides a quite good ground for analysis and comparisons. And again, going very quickly, what we then saw through the offline research was that a lot of the binaries that people use today to create in-group, out-group demarcations where the other is antagonized on a number of grounds, race, religion, culture, origin, are often present also in the presentations of the Iron Age and Roman past that is put forward at museums and other heritage places, with a lot of very good exceptions, but with this very consolidated trend towards certain kinds of presentations. So, for example, presentations through reenactment and educational activity that tend to emphasize a crafty, skillful, sustainable Iron Age world and a quite male, militarized Roman past instead. And at school, and what is in the curriculum is also interesting. In what is in the English curriculum, because we know the Scottish and Welsh curricula are quite different and less sort of prescribed. But there too, prehistory is something that appears in 2013, was not present before between 1989 and 2013. The presentation of history starts from the Romans, the arrival of the Romans at Key Stage 2 in primary schools. Thereafter, the prehistory is introduced, but these 2 periods are still presented as sharply distinct, in opposition to one another, and with very few nuances when it comes to geographical differences or chronological variations, contributing to some of those bigger stereotypes that then continue to grow in people's minds. That sometimes contrast with equally stereotypical ways of presenting the past that we can find, for example, in films, in television, but even in online gaming. there are sometimes tensions. So I mentioned this skilled Iron Age, sustainable, resourceful Iron Age past that we often find presented at heritage venues and museums. Well, that is often in contrast to a quite fierce freedom fighter type of Iron Age presented through films and television and gaming. So all these oppositions appear in the everyday experiences that we have of the past and then stick. And it's something that we carry with us and then reuse in non-inclusive ways when referring to political ideas. And something that we've been doing, and with this I'll close, to follow up from this research that I have very briefly touched upon, and I hope it kind of made sense nevertheless, was a project that tried to tackle some of these binary ways of presenting the past at heritage places and through education. A project called Tolerant Futures, again, collaboratively conducted with Durham and 9 other museums and heritage venues in England, Scotland and Wales. What we wanted to do was to create an educational resource in the form of a chatbot that could challenge exaggerated stereotypical ways of presenting these two periods and tried to nuance it without reinventing the past or sanitizing it at all, but just to stress, again, nuances and trying to break the idea of binaries that sit in people's mind. So through this, basically through free and open source software, we could create this chatbot that is still available at this link, chatbot.tolerantfutures.com. This is a resource that introduces a conversation between different characters that live at different points of the Iron Age and the Roman period, which is a very long period of history, and in different regions of the British Isle, and speak to each other and to the person that interacts with them today, so the user, and talk about identity. So this is we thought to use it as a way to talk about difference and ways of seeing the other in a non-antagonistic way through today, through the past, essentially, through a kind of storytelling experience that could bring the past to life. And I should say that this was mainly the work of Kate Sharp at Durham, who developed this great resource that started to be used, and we're now about to evaluate formally in collaboration with development psychologists here at the University of Edinburgh. So thank you very much, and apology if it was a very light and overarching type of presentation.
Thank you, Chiara. Very informative, engaging talk. Okay, now we are open for questions. If you have any comments, questions, please send them via the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. Okay, we have a comment from Adam. He says, thanks, Chiara, for a very fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions, probably?
Why maybe people are waiting, let me... Oh yeah, sorry. Adam, he has a question.
Yes, it's more that's a question.
Sorry, I'll just use the microphone if that's all right. This was really interesting to me. I am currently teaching an undergraduate class on classical archaeology methods with an ethics focus, and we just did our unit on nationalism. And I was curious, because I usually bring this up, to move out of the large data environment and ask a question about symbols. Do you have thoughts on the role of the BBC and Amazon Prime television series Britannia, which seemed very much to be a response to this question of identity that focused on indigenous Britishness versus the evil Roman conquerors?
Unfortunately, not yet, because I haven't. You mean in relation to the its reception?
In relation to its reception into dialogues of identity and belonging, specifically around the time of Brexit.
Yeah, no, not yet, because something that, and this is a good question also because it leads me to say a bit more about the follow-up. Something that I haven't done, and which I am doing now, is to look at the dynamics of the dissemination and rehashing, so not just reuse of some of these symbols by different actors within the media, environment. So looking at online platforms, but also how communications by online newspaper articles and series and so on are being rehashed. I did it to some extent for the trope that I mentioned on the fall of Rome, but that was to understand what kinds of expert sources were used and how. It wasn't a systematic, formal analysis of the rehashing process behind the use of these symbols, which is something that I'm starting to work on now. But thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you, Chiara. Thank you, Adam. Do we have any other questions? Oh, Marco, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chiara. Just a question. I mean, because you mentioned, I'm not sure whether I need to call them data. So you mentioned 1.2 million, let's call it them data. But then you said only 300 times Roman was mentioned together with Britannian and Barbar, 200 times Adrian, 100 times Norman. So let's say out of 1.2 million, you only have 500 that go back to this ancient past, etc. Was it a surprise for you? And obviously, it just resonates for me. It's like, does it really matter? So what is the relevance? If out of 1.2, you only have 500, does it really matter? Is it really worth investigating? Sorry, it's a bit provocative here, but yeah, what would be your answer to this?
My answer is that yes, it's worth investigating, because it's not the fact that is or is not there. It's not, well, there's two parts in your question. First, whether out of the huge subset, like as I stress also in the book, like out of this huge quantity of data, 60 million, a few thousand did have mentions of the past. Was it surprising? To some extent, yes. When we did the first case study, which was the pilot for the whole study, so the Brexit case study. But to some extent, no, because we are looking here at something, as I was saying at the beginning, that is quite rare. So finding traces without using surveys, so without using social research methods that actually question directly, finding those rare instances where people serendipitously refer to the present through mentions of the past. It's something that is quite rare to find, sort of in a way, through methods that don't solicit that directly. But that doesn't mean that it's not a quantitative reflection of the times that we might have this internalized process of thinking about the present through mentions of the past. It's just the surface of what is evidenced, so it's our door into that process. But that process is there. Historical consciousness and historical sense making is something very powerful. Our experiences of the past, what we've been taught and what we've experienced in different ways through different kinds of media experiences, is part of us. It does influence the way in which we think about the kind of present we want and the kind of future we would like to have. The other thing I stress is that I expose these uses of the past, the different uses of the past that are played out in different contexts. But in my conclusion, I also stress to look at the extent of which these are used and leveraged by specific, people and socio-demographic also subsets within our society. Obviously, we would need different kinds of methods. We would need to ground these exploratory work in, for example, survey-based research, which again is something that I'm embarking on now.
Yes, thank you. I do agree. There is no nation without the past, so it's just a matter to understand how the past is mobilized, by whom, when, etc. But I do see questions in the chat, so thank you very much. Thank you, Chiara.
Welcome.
Okay, so we have two more questions in the chat. A question from Leila. She asked, what's the project's normative position on nationalism? Do resources for children aim to foster an inclusive national identity or to encourage looking beyond the nation in understanding the past and its relation to identities today?
So the Tolerant Future Project doesn't engage with the idea of nationalism. It talks about ideas of the other and include non-antagonistic ideas of the other. How can we think of the other in ways that are non-antagonistic? I mean, identity is, yes, all about differences. There is an us and there is a them, and there's belonging to a group and not belonging to another group. The point is, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to antagonize those that you see as being others and different from you. The point of the project is to talk about tolerance, understood as understanding and accepting difference in ways that are non-antagonistic. And I know that tolerance is not an ideal word, either. So that is also has its sort of problems too. But again, how do we understand the other, and how can we talk about the other in non-antagonistic ways? The chatbot essentially is a resource that can help teachers to talk about this in the classroom through the past. As I said, there is no sanitized presentation of the past, so you will see there will be war and there will be slavery there, but it's challenged in the present. So the user in the present can ask questions. I think it's a bit complicated to describe if you can't interact with it, but if you have a play, you'll see that you can ask questions, and we introduce the sort of challenging voice as the one of the user that observes a certain reality in the past, sometimes more inclusive than you would think there is, in other cases brutal, violent and full of slavery, but questions it with respect to what happens and what we believe in the present. But it doesn't touch upon nationalism.
Okay, thank you, Chiara. I hope that answers Leila's question. We have another one from Michael, and his question is, do these sorts of debates happen in other countries? And if so, how are they different or similar to the ones taking place in the UK?
Well, some of these origin myths will be similar, again, maybe played out in different ways. Are you mentioning that whether are you referring to the uses of the past and if they're similar or different? Specifically uses of the past, because some of these uses, yes, some of these myths will be similar. Christian Christensen, who's like a famous archaeologist, talks very much about these sort of European myths of origin that tend more or less to attach themselves to a Roman past or to a native pre-Roman or a free resistant post-Roman past. But there are also other myths that are more specific to other countries, and in any case, each of these myths and oppositions come to support slightly different narratives. Although the macro themes that we see recurring, mobility, migration, the role of, the how we perceive others based on origin, based on culture, based on religion, based on race, tend to sort of recur.
Okay, thank you. And are there any other questions for Chiara? We have probably 5 minutes. I see there are some people say thanks very much for the interesting talk. Okay. If there's no question, probably we can finish here. Thank you again, Chiara, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for coming. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And please, we also have another seminar in April, and yeah, hopefully we can see you then.